The first sound I heard wasn't a knock, it was ice.
Sheets of it were sliding off the cabin roof and shattering against the porch steps in the dark, one after another, like something up there wanted my attention before the people did. Then came the knock, 3 gloved fists at once, and under it my husband's voice, thin and cracked from the cold. Maya, open the door."
I was standing in front of 4 monitors at the time, watching him and his 2 grown children cross my snowfield in a wind that had already dropped the air to 9 degrees, watching the 3 of them stagger toward the one building on that mountain that still had heat, light, and water, because the house they had chosen over my father 4 hours earlier didn't have any of those things anymore.
I want to tell you I felt satisfaction. I didn't, not yet. What I felt was the particular kind of calm that shows up right before you do something you can never take back.
My name is Maya Whitfield. I spent 22 years in the United States Air Force as a contracting and logistics officer, which is a phrase that has made exactly one person's eyes light up at exactly one dinner party in my entire career, and made everyone else's glaze over, including, eventually, my husband's family. To them, I wasn't the woman who had kept fuel, food, and medical resupply moving into places most road atlases didn't bother naming. I was Rick's wife, who does paperwork. That was the whole file on me. Paperwork. It is a strange thing, being the person other people's safety quietly depends on, and never once getting credit for it, because the job is built to be invisible when it's done well. Nobody remembers the name of the officer who made sure the generators for a forward medical unit had fuel through an unplanned 6-week extension. Nobody toasts the contracting shop that renegotiated a spoiled ration contract at 2 in the morning so 400 people had breakfast. You learn to find the satisfaction in the outcome instead of the applause, because the applause was never coming. I had assumed, for years, that this was simply the shape of the work. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to notice that I had started applying the same quiet, uncredited endurance to my marriage, and that nobody there was keeping score of what it cost me either. 12 hours before that knock, I had been standing in my own kitchen, in the big house Rick and I shared up on Cutter's Ridge, watching my 74-year-old father get turned away from the living room over a rug. "It's not that you can't come in, Frank." Courtney said it the way she said most things, gently enough that you could almost miss the door closing behind it. "It's just, that runner is 140 years old. It's not really a walk-on-it kind of rug." My father looked down at his boots, at the slush already starting to bead on the mat by the door, and did what he always did when someone made him feel like an inconvenience. He apologized. "Of course," he said. "Didn't think."
"There's a stool in the mudroom," Courtney said. "You'll be able to hear the TV from there." I set down the coffee pot harder than I meant to. "He's not sitting in the mudroom, Courtney."
"It's 5 feet away, Maya. It's not a punishment." She said my name the way she always did, like it was a job title she'd been assigned, rather than a person she'd chosen to marry into. "We just did the floors." Rick didn't look up from his phone. That was the part that told me everything, though I wouldn't understand how much until later that night. Not the rug, not Courtney. The fact that my husband of 11 years let his daughter redirect my disabled father into an unheated mudroom during a blizzard warning and found something on his phone more urgent than saying a single word about it. I want to be fair to that morning, because fair matters to me, even now, even about this. The forecast wasn't apocalyptic yet. It was a winter storm watch, the kind our county gets 4 or 5 times a season, the kind everyone half ignores until it isn't ignorable anymore. Nobody in that kitchen thought anyone was going to freeze. They just thought my father's leg brace and his portable oxygen concentrator and the particular shuffle of his walk were worth less than a rug his own daughter-in-law had bled money to bring home. I should tell you about my father, because he is not a small character in this, and I won't let him become one. Frank Whitfield spent 31 years running the machine floor at a furniture plant 2 counties over, until a forklift pinned his left leg against a support post and ended that career in about 4 seconds. He walks with a cane on good days and a walker on bad ones, and he carries a small oxygen unit for the COPD that 31 years of sawdust left him with. He is also, without question, the driest, funniest man I have ever met, and he raised me alone from the time I was 9, and he never once, in 38 years, made me feel like I was too much trouble to love. So when my new family decided he was a stool in the mudroom problem, I did not experience that as an insult to an old man. I experienced it as a diagnosis. It told me exactly how they saw me, filtered through how they treated the person who mattered most to me in the world. "He can sit at the table," I said, "with the rest of us, like a person."
Maya, Rick finally looked up. "Let's not make this a whole thing."
That phrase, "let's not make this a whole thing," I had heard some version of it for 11 years, applied to almost every moment I had asked to be treated like an equal partner instead of a logistics contractor for other people's comfort. I had heard it when I asked why my name wasn't on the deed to the house we picked out together. I'd heard it Blake's temporary stays in the guest room kept turning into 6-month arrangements I found out about after the fact. I had learned, slowly and against every instinct 22 years of service had built into me, to let that phrase mean I'm choosing them again, and to stop expecting anything different. My father sat on the stool in the mudroom. I brought him coffee and a blanket, an old army surplus wool one, olive drab, scratchy as a bad decision, that had belonged to my grandfather and then to me during 3 different deployments before it ended up folded at the foot of our bed. Courtney had called it once at a Thanksgiving 2 years back, the trailer trash blanket, and laughed like it was a joke everyone was in on. I had not laughed. I had also not said anything, which I understood now was its own kind of surrender. "You don't have to do this every time," my father said quietly, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. "I can go on home."
"You're not driving in this, Dad, and you're not sitting out here alone."
"I'm all right, Maya Bird." He still called me that from when I was small enough to sit on his shoulders during the county fireworks. I've sat in worse places than a nice mudroom. That almost broke something in me. The gentle joke wrapped around a real wound. I sat down on an overturned bucket across him, ignoring the noise of the family in the next room, and stayed there with him for 20 minutes while the wind started picking up outside the window, until the National Weather Service alert on my phone stopped being a watch and turned, with a flat mechanical buzz, into a warning. The blanket around his shoulders that afternoon was the same one I mentioned earlier, and it was not the first time it had been the subject of a joke in that house. 2 Thanksgivings back, my father had draped it over his legs at the dinner table because the dining room ran cold, and Courtney had leaned toward her husband, not quite quiet enough, and said, "Somebody find Frank a real blanket. That thing looks like it came out of a bunker." Everyone at the table had laughed the easy, reflexive laugh people give a joke they don't examine too closely. My father had laughed too, the way he always did, absorbing the smallest cruelty so nobody else had to feel bad about delivering it. I remember looking at Rick that day, waiting for him to say something, anything, and watching him refill his wine glass instead. I had told myself, at the time, that it wasn't worth a fight over a blanket. I understand now that it was never about the blanket. It was a test of whether my family, my actual family, the 2 people who had never once made me feel small, would be defended the same way his family always was. I had failed that test as much as he had, by staying quiet. I just hadn't been ready to call it a failure yet. I want to talk for a minute about the cabin, because it becomes important later, and because I never talked about it much to anyone, which is exactly why nobody in that house understood what they were about to walk into. Before I met Rick, before the Air Force ever sent me anywhere with a name that didn't appear on unclassified maps, I bought 11 acres on the far side of Cutter's Ridge, with money my grandfather left me and 2 years of untouched hazard duty and family separation pay. Over the better part of a decade, on leave and during 2 long stateside assignments, I built what everyone in the family dismissed from the outside as Maya's cabin: solar and battery power redundant to a backup generator, a drilled well and filtration system, 8 months of stored food, satellite communications that didn't depend on the county's above-ground lines. I built it the way I built supply chains for a living, assuming the worst case and planning 3 layers past it, because that instinct doesn't turn off just because you take the uniform off. Rick had been inside it exactly twice in 11 years. Courtney and Blake, never. To them, it was the ugly little building on the far acreage that Maya wouldn't sell, even when they suggested, more than once, that the land would be worth more as a rental cabin they could manage. "It's basically wasted out there," Courtney had said at that same Thanksgiving, "just sitting empty." I had smiled and changed the subject, the way I'd learned to do with most things that were actually mine. It was under my name only, Whitfield, not Carell. I had never added Rick to the deed, not out of distrust, not at first, just the same instinct that kept a personal go-bag packed for 22 years. Rick had asked once, early in the marriage, half joking, why I hadn't folded the land into the house paperwork. I'd told him I liked having one thing in the world that didn't require a conversation to maintain. He'd laughed and let it go, and neither of us understood, at the time, how much that single unexamined decision would end up mattering. I want to back up for a moment, because there was a piece of this I already had in hand weeks before that storm, and I didn't understand its weight until much later that night.
In early October, Blake had called the house looking for Rick, and Rick had been out getting the truck serviced, so I'd ended up on the phone with my stepson for 11 unusually long minutes. He'd sounded keyed up, talking fast about a logistics startup, something to do with regional freight brokering, asking whether I still had contacts from my Air Force days who might want to invest or consult. It was the kind of vague, upward-sounding pitch I'd heard a dozen times from junior officers with more confidence than a business plan, and I told him, honestly, that I'd need to see numbers before I put anyone's name near it.
Dad's already helping me get it off the ground, he'd said. Bridge funding, just till the first contracts land.
How much bridge funding?
It's handled, Maya. I just wanted to know if you had contacts, that's all. I'd let it go. Rick had confirmed, later that week, in the same easy tone he used for most things he didn't want examined closely, that he was helping Blake with a business opportunity. Nothing you need to worry about. I remember thinking at the time that it was oddly generous of a man who complained about our own mortgage rate to be quietly bankrolling his son's startup. And then I remember doing what I had trained myself to do with 100 small inconsistencies over 11 years of marriage, filing it under things that probably meant nothing, because examining it would mean starting a fight I didn't have the energy for that particular week. I did not yet know there was no freight brokerage. I did not yet know there had never been contracts waiting to land.
I only knew, sitting in that kitchen months later, watching my father get redirected to a mudroom stool, that something about the whole story had never quite sat right, the way a supply manifest never quite sits right, when the numbers technically balance, but the dates don't make sense if you actually read them in order. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the power flickered twice at the main house. By 5, it held steady, but the wind had climbed past 40 miles an hour, and the temperature outside had fallen into the low teens. My father's oxygen concentrator ran on battery for 2 hours at most, before it needed wall power, and I watched the little indicator light on it start blinking amber, while Courtney supervised takeout menus in the kitchen, like nothing in the house had changed. "He needs to be somewhere with reliable power," I told Rick, quietly, in the hallway. "If we lose electricity out here, that unit dies in 2 hours.
We're not going to lose power, Maya. We've got a generator.
That generator hasn't been serviced since March. I told you that in September. You always think the worst is going to happen. He said it like an accusation, though it was, I would come to understand very shortly, a precise description of the only reason any of us were about to survive that night. By 5:30, my father had been moved a second time, this time from the mudroom stool to the attached garage, because Courtney wanted to run the fireplace and needed, in her words, everybody who wasn't actively watching the fire out of the sightline of the guests she still somehow expected to arrive, despite the county's travel advisory. The garage had no heat source of its own, beyond what leaked in from the house, and by then the wind chill outside had dropped into the single digits. I found him sitting on an overturned paint bucket next to the lawnmower, the oxygen concentrator's amber light blinking steadily now instead of solid, his breath visible in the cold garage air. "This isn't a joke anymore, Rick," I said, finding my husband back in the living room, watching the fire he'd built for company that wasn't coming. "His oxygen unit needs wall power in under 2 hours, or it switches to battery only, and the battery's rated for 90 minutes on a good day, which this is not." "Then plug it in somewhere in the house." "There's no outlet reachable from where they've put him." "So, move the cord. Maya, I have had a very long day. Can you handle this the way you handle everything else?" It was meant, I think, as a kind of compliment, the way people who have never had to handle anything themselves sometimes hand you a crisis like a gift. I did not experience it that way.
I experienced it as the exact moment I stopped waiting for him to notice what was happening to my father in his own garage. At 6:40, the power went out for good. The backup generator turned over twice, coughed, and died. Old fuel, a cracked line, exactly what I'd warned about 5 months earlier and been told, gently, not to make a whole thing about. Within 30 minutes, the temperature inside the main house had already started to drop, and my father's oxygen unit switched fully to its dwindling battery. I made the decision then, the first of several that night, though it didn't feel dramatic at the time. It felt like triage. "I'm taking Dad to the cabin," I told Rick. "It's got backup power and heat. You and the kids should come too. Honestly, it's safer than sitting here waiting on the county."
Courtney's face did something complicated. "The cabin? Maya, it doesn't even have real plumbing."
It has plumbing, Courtney. It has more reliable plumbing than this house has right now.
"We'll be fine here," Rick said. "It's one night. We've got blankets, we've got the fireplace."
Dad can't do a fireplace and blankets night, Rick. His lungs can't do that.
There was a pause, the kind I'd feel later in my chest more than I remembered hearing with my ears. Then Rick said, in the calm, reasonable voice he used whenever he was choosing his children over me, "Then take him. We'll manage here." I did not argue. Some decisions aren't worth the breath. I got my father into his coat, wrapped him in the old wool blanket, loaded his oxygen concentrator and 2 spare battery packs into my truck, and drove the 1.5 miles of unplowed road to the cabin, through wind that was already throwing sideways snow across the headlights. I did not know, as I made that drive, how much I still had left to find out that night. The cabin came alive the way it always did when I walked in and set the panel to full power, lights warming from amber to full white, the floor heat clicking on beneath the mudroom tile, the low hum of the water pump starting somewhere under the house. My father stood in the doorway a long moment, taking it in, the concentrator's low, steady beep the only proof he needed that the electricity here was real. "Lord, Maya," he said, "I always figured this place for a glorified tool shed." "That's the idea," I said, hanging his coat by the door. "Nobody's supposed to know different." I got him settled in the recliner near the wood stove, checked that his oxygen levels were reading normal on the pulse oximeter I kept in the first aid kit, and made him tea he pretended to want more than he did. For a little while, with the storm screaming outside 18 inches of insulated wall, it was almost peaceful. It was the first time all day I'd stopped bracing for the next small cruelty. "You built all this yourself?" he asked, looking around at the exposed timber beams, the bank of monitors dark in the back room, the neat rows of stacked supplies visible through the pantry door. "Mostly on leave, a little at a time, over about 8 years.
And Rick never wanted to help with that?
Rick never really wanted to know about it, I said. I think it made him uncomfortable, a wife who didn't need him to feel safe. My father was quiet for a while, turning his mug slowly in his hands. "Your mother was like that, a little, fierce about not needing anybody. Took me years to understand that wasn't the same thing as not wanting anybody." He looked at me over the rim of the mug. "You don't have to choose one or the other, Maya Bird. Being able to survive a storm on your own and wanting somebody worth weathering it with, those aren't opposites. I don't think you've let yourself believe that in a long while." I didn't have an answer for him that night. I just sat with it, the fire popping steadily in the stove, the wind working at the shutters outside, and let my father say a true thing to me without needing to argue it away, which was its own small kind of rest after a day that hadn't offered much of one. That peace lasted until I sat down at the desk in the back room, out of habit more than anything, to check the household accounts before bed, something I did most nights, a holdover from 2 decades of never letting a supply chain run unmonitored. I pulled up the joint checking account first, then, almost as an afterthought, the browser tab I kept bookmarked for the twins' education fund. Ella and Sam were 16, currently safe 40 minutes away at my sister's house in town, probably watching the storm from a window with hot chocolate, and no idea any of this was happening. Their 529 plan was the one piece of our finances I watched more closely than anything else. Not out of suspicion, just out of the plain math of 2 teenagers and a state university system that got more expensive every single year I checked.
The balance was $11,000 lower than it should have been.
I sat very still for a moment, the way you do when a number doesn't match the story you've been telling yourself about your own life. Then I opened the transaction history. 4 withdrawals over 5 months, each one just under $3,000. Each one routed to an outside account I didn't recognize. Each one authorized, according to the timestamp and the login record, by my own credentials. 2 of those 4 dates, I checked against my old service calendar out of pure reflex. I'd retired from active duty 18 months earlier, but the reserve still called me back for the occasional symposium, which is how I ended up at Scott Air Force Base for a logistics symposium on both of them, 600 miles away, without so much as a laptop open past 9 at night, according to my own trip log. I had not logged into that account. I had not authorized anything. I sat with that for exactly as long as it took to feel the old training kick in, the part of me that had spent 2 decades learning that panic is a luxury you deal with after the problem is contained, not before. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to how the rest of that night went. I did not call Rick first. I did not knock on his conscience and give him one more chance to explain himself before I moved. I had already, 3 weeks earlier, quietly retained a family law attorney named Denise Okafor in the county seat, after finding a pattern of unexplained cash withdrawals I couldn't account for, and a growing unease I hadn't been ready to name out loud yet. I had told no one. I had simply started building a file, the way I'd been trained to build a file on anything that didn't add up. That night, sitting at the desk with my father dozing in the next room, and the wind trying the shutters like a hand testing a locked door, I finally understood what the file was for. I called Denise. It was 9:15 at night, and she picked up on the second ring, because I'd warned her weeks earlier that if I ever called after hours, it would be because something had finally moved. "Talk to me," she said. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone doing legal math in her head. "Maya, I need you to listen carefully. If those withdrawals happened without your authorization, that's not a marital dispute anymore. That's potential fraud against a minor's education account, and it changes what I can do tonight instead of Monday. Do you want to file now?" We had already discussed, weeks earlier, exactly what file now would mean, back when this was still theoretical. In our state, the moment a divorce petition is filed, an automatic temporary restraining order goes into effect on both parties. No more transfers, no more withdrawals, no more moving of shared or disputed assets until the court sorts out who owns what. It is not dramatic. It is not even really about anger. It is a lock on a door that was standing wide open. "Maya, I want to make sure you're deciding this and not the adrenaline," Denise said. "It's after 9 at night. You're snowed in. Your father's with you. I can hold everything ready and file first thing in the morning if you'd rather sit with it overnight." "I've been sitting with it for 11 years, Denise. I don't need the night." "Okay, then tell me the account numbers again, slowly, and I'll read them back to you before I touch anything." She was careful that way, methodical, which was half of why I'd hired her. She treated a marriage the same clinical, unsentimental way I treated a broken supply chain, looking for the actual point of failure instead of the noise around it. I read her the numbers. She read them back. I heard her typing somewhere on the other end, steady and unhurried, and there was something almost soothing in the sound of a competent person doing exactly what she said she would do, at exactly the moment she said she'd do it. It had been a long time since anything in my house had worked that way. "File it," I said, "tonight, and send the notice to his email, not his phone. I don't want this getting deleted before it lands." "You understand this means serve notice could reach him within hours, depending on how fast the process server can get out in this weather." "He's not going anywhere tonight, Denise. Neither am I." I hung up and sat there a moment longer, looking at the 4 withdrawal dates on the screen, feeling something that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to recognition. The specific, cold clarity of finally understanding a shape you'd been staring at sideways for years. My father's voice came from the next room, gravelly with half sleep. "You all right in there, Maya Bird?" "I'm all right, Dad." I was, mostly. "Go back to sleep." He didn't, not quite. A few minutes later, I heard the recliner creak and found him standing carefully in the doorway, leaning on his cane, looking at me with the particular expression he'd worn since I was 9 years old, whenever he suspected I was carrying something I hadn't told him about. "Rick called the house phone earlier. he said. Old landline, the one out here you never got around to disconnecting. Rang while you were in the shower. I picked it up out of habit. What did you want? Wasn't him talking. Some fellow with a real unfriendly voice, asking for Blake. Said if Blake didn't have $4,000 by Friday, quote, this stops being a phone call. I didn't say anything, just hung up. Didn't seem like my business. He paused. Seemed like it might be yours, though, the way your face just went. I felt the last piece slide into place with an almost audible click. The withdrawals, the timing, Rick's endless, evasive talk about helping Blake with a business opportunity that I'd never gotten a straight answer about, no matter how many times I'd asked. It wasn't a business opportunity. It was a debt. And my husband had apparently decided that the fastest way to make it disappear was to quietly bleed it out of an account meant to put his own younger children to college, $4,000 at a time, and hope I never checked closely enough to notice.
Dad, I said, I think I understand something now I should have understood a long time ago.
Want to tell me?
Not yet. I want to be sure first.
He nodded, the way he always did when I told him I needed room to work, and shuffled back to the recliner, pulling the old wool blanket up over his knees. I sat at that desk for another hour, pulling every statement I had access to, cross-referencing dates against my own travel records, building, out of pure habit, the same habit that had once tracked fuel convoys across 3 time zones, a clean, dated, defensible timeline. I did not do it because I thought I'd need to prove anything to Rick. I did it because that is simply what I do with a problem. I contain it, I document it, and then I decide what happens next from a position where nobody can successfully lie to my face about what already happened.
It was almost 11 when the headlights swept across the cabin's front windows. I watched on the security monitor as Rick's truck fishtailed slightly coming up the unplowed drive, Courtney's small SUV crawling behind it. Both vehicles caked in snow and ice, hazards blinking uselessly in a storm too loud to hear them over. I watched 3 shapes climb out and start toward the porch, hunched against wind that was by then gusting close to 50.
My phone buzzed. A text from Rick. House is freezing. Pipe burst upstairs. Water everywhere. No power for hours, the county says. We're coming to you. I did not answer it. I watched them cross the last 30 yards on foot because I hadn't unlocked the outer gate, and Rick's truck couldn't get past it in the drifts. And I felt, for the first time that night, the shape of the decision in front of me solidify into something I already knew I was going to do. On the monitor, in grainy infrared, I watched them fight their way up the drive, one exposed step at a time. Courtney's arms were wrapped tight across her chest, Rick half turned into the wind, both of them lit an unnatural white-green, their breath tearing apart in ragged clouds before it fully formed. They reached the porch. That was the knock I told you about at the beginning. 3 gloved fists, my husband's voice cracked from cold, calling my name like it was owed to him. I want to explain what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't cruelty, whatever it might sound like from the outside. I looked at the monitor and saw my husband, genuinely afraid, genuinely cold, a man I had loved for 11 years, standing on the wrong side of a door for maybe the first time in his life. I felt something close to grief for him. And behind him, I saw Courtney, arms wrapped around herself, already talking, her mouth moving fast even though I couldn't hear the words yet, and something in the tilt of her chin told me exactly what kind of conversation she thought she was about to have. I opened the intercom. Maya, thank God. Rick's voice, tinny through the speaker, ragged. Let us in, it's brutal out here. I can hear that, I said. Where's Blake?
A pause. He took his own car. He's maybe 10 minutes behind us. The roads are bad.
You left him on the roads in this. He insisted he could drive it himself, Maya. We don't have time to stand here arguing about Blake. We're freezing. Courtney leaned toward the intercom's camera, close enough that I could see the exact moment her expression shifted from cold to calculating. Maya, we get it. You're upset about earlier, about the rug thing, and I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry, but this isn't the time. You can't leave people outside in a blizzard. Do you understand how that looks? If something happens to us out here, that's on you. That's the kind of thing people call the sheriff about. There it was.
Not an apology built on understanding what she'd done, an apology built on leverage, a threat wrapped in concern for optics, delivered by someone who fully expected it to work, because it always had.
You left my 74-year-old father on a stool in an unheated mudroom this afternoon, I said, keeping my voice level in the particular way I'd trained into myself over 2 decades of briefing rooms, where the worst thing you could do was let anyone see you rattled. Over a rug.
That is completely different. It's exactly the same shape, Courtney. It's just pointed at me now instead of him.
She tried a different angle, the way people do when the first one stalls out. You know what this is going to look like to everyone, right? To the twins, to Dad's whole side, to your own church people. Maya Whitfield, the war hero, locking her family out in a blizzard over money. Is that really the story you want everyone telling? Somewhere in the years I'd spent married to this family, that particular threat, the fear of how something would look rather than what it actually was, had worked on me more times than I like to count. It didn't work on me that night. Maybe it was the cold clarifying things, or maybe it was simply that I had finally run the numbers on how much of my life I'd spent managing other people's optics at my own expense, and come up short.
The story is going to be that a woman with a warm, stocked, fully powered building down the road called the County Fire Company and got you a hot meal and a cot within the hour, I said. You're welcome to tell it however else you'd like.
Rick's voice cut back in, quieter, almost pleading. Maya, please. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just let us warm up first. We can talk about all of it after. And there it was, the second thing I needed to hear before I did what I was about to do. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I need to tell you what I did. Just let us in first, and we'll figure out what you need to hear after. He still believed, standing in 9-degree wind with his children beside him, that the order of operations was going to work in his favor one more time. That the mudroom stool and the rug and 11 years of let's not make this a whole thing had earned him the presumption that whatever came next, I would absorb it, the way I always had. I looked at the folder open on the desk beside me, the withdrawal dates, the travel log, Denise's confirmation email that the petition and the automatic restraining order had been filed and timestamped at 9:41 that evening. And I understood that I was not choosing cruelty over compassion. I was choosing accuracy over performance, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. I stepped out onto the covered part of the porch, close enough to the storm door that they could see me, but the wind couldn't reach the papers in my hand. My father's voice came from behind me, low. You want me to stand here with you? No, Dad, stay warm. I've got this. I opened the storm doors 6 inches, no more, cold slicing through the gap like a blade. Rick, I said, I know about the twins' college fund. I know about the 4 withdrawals. I know about the man who called this house looking for $4,000 by Friday for Blake. His face did something I will remember for a long time. Not shock exactly, more like watching a structure that had been quietly failing for years finally show its cracks in daylight. Courtney's mouth opened and then closed again, and something in her expression told me she hadn't known. Not the details, though she had clearly known enough to guess. Maya, I can explain. You can. Later, to a court, if it comes to that. Because as of 9:41 tonight, this is not a conversation between a husband and wife anymore. I filed for divorce 2 hours ago. In this state, that filing automatically freezes every joint and disputed account, effective the moment it's entered, which means whatever you are planning to move tomorrow or the day after, you can't. Not legally. Not without answering for it. You filed tonight? While you were choosing your children over my father this afternoon, I was still just angry, Rick. I filed after I found out you'd been stealing from your own kids to pay off Blake's gambling debt. I let that sit in the cold air a moment. I need you to understand something else, too. This cabin, this land, it's never belonged to us. It's mine. It was mine before you, it's on a separate deed, under my maiden name, and it is not, tonight or any other night, a shelter you get to claim just because the house you actually built together turned out not to hold up. You'd leave us out here.
Courtney's voice cracked, real fear finally breaking through the leverage in it. In this?
No, I said. I already called it in 20 minutes ago, before you got here. The county's running a shuttle from the fire station on Route 9 to the high school shelter. They've got heat, cots, hot food, and they're expecting 3 more people. It's 4 miles from here, and the road's still passable that direction. The plow's been through twice tonight because it's the emergency route. I'm not leaving you in a blizzard. I'm telling you that you don't get to be warm in my house tonight, and those are 2 very different things.
I held the folder out through the gap in the door, not the whole file, just the top page, the copy of the filing with the timestamp clearly visible, and a printed map with the shelter route highlighted in yellow marker, the kind of thing I'd have handed a convoy driver 100 times without a second thought.
Rick stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something else if he looked long enough. He didn't reach for them.
You had a lawyer 3 weeks ago, he said slowly, before any of this.
I had a lawyer 3 weeks ago because I noticed money disappearing 3 weeks ago, and I have spent my entire adult life not moving on a problem until I understood its full shape. I understand it now. Courtney reached past her father and snatched the papers instead, scanning them fast, her breath fogging in ragged clouds. I watched her get to the line about the automatic restraining order and watched the exact moment it landed, the particular stillness of someone recalculating every threat they thought they had left.
You can't just... This is insane! You're going to let an old man's comfort blanket decide our whole future?
No, I said. I'm letting 11 years of deciding I don't matter as much as your comfort decide it. The blanket's just what he had left when your mudroom stool was the alternative.
Headlights swept the drive behind them. Blake's car, sliding to a stop at an angle that told me he'd taken the last curve faster than the ice allowed. He climbed out, already shouting something I couldn't make out over the wind, and I watched Rick turn towards his son with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had worn some version of it myself for 11 years. The look of a man about to protect someone who had never once, not one time, protected him back.
4 miles to the shelter, I said again. Route 9, follow the plow marks. I already told the fire company you were coming. They'll have coffee on.
I closed the storm door. I did not slam it. I want that understood clearly, because there is a version of this story where I would have wanted to, where the satisfaction would have needed a loud door to feel complete. It didn't. I turned the deadbolt, watched the porch light automatically dim to its low night setting through the monitor, and went back inside to where my father was sitting exactly where I'd left him, hands folded over the old wool blanket, watching me with an expression that held no triumph in it either, just steadiness, the same steadiness he'd been giving me my whole life.
They gone? He asked. They're going to the shelter. It's safe. Warm even, eventually.
And you?
I'm staying right here with you. I sat down on the floor beside the recliner, the way I used to when I was small, and the power went out at our old house, and he'd tell me stories until the lights came back. Is that all right? Maya bird, he said, and reached over to rest one hand, weathered and steady, on top of my head, the way he had 1,000 times before. That is exactly all right. We watched on the monitor the taillights of 2 vehicles picking their way carefully down the mountain toward Route 9, red smears against the white, until the storm swallowed them completely. The sheriff's deputy who did the welfare check an hour later confirmed, over the radio Denise had asked me to keep on, that all 3 had arrived safely at the high school gym, cold and shaken but unhurt, and that Blake in particular had spent a long while sitting by himself near the coffee station, not talking to anyone. I felt nothing about that news except a kind of tired relief, the specific relief of a supply line that had, despite everything, held. The forensic review confirmed a 5th withdrawal I'd missed, and a signature a handwriting analyst called inconsistent with the account holder's known signature. Rick didn't contest it. The court ordered restitution, plus interest, from whatever marital assets remained. It will take him years, and I am not sorry. I told Ella and Sam myself, at the kitchen table at my sister's house, 3 days after the storm, once the roads were clear and I'd had time to make sure I could say it without my voice doing anything I didn't want it to do. I did not tell them everything. They didn't need the exact dollar figures or the details of a debt collector's voice on a dead landline, but I told them the truth in the shape they were old enough to hold, that their father had taken money meant for their future without asking, that I had caught it and stopped it, and that it was already being fixed. Sam asked, very quietly, whether that meant Dad didn't love them. I told him it meant their father had made a choice he was ashamed of, and that those were two different things, even though I understood, watching his face, that 16 is not always old enough to feel the difference. Ella didn't say much at all. She got up, hugged me hard enough that I felt it in my ribs, and said, "I'm glad you check things, Mom. I know it's annoying sometimes." It was, without question, the best thing anyone said to me that entire winter. Blake did not go to prison, and I want to be honest that I never wanted him to. He called Ella once, awkwardly, to apologize for something he never fully named. Courtney and I have not spoken since. I don't imagine we will for a long while, if ever, and I have made a kind of peace with that particular door staying shut. Some relationships were never load-bearing in the first place. You only find out when the storm hits which walls were holding anything up. Rick moved out in February, once the roads cleared enough for moving trucks. On his last day at the house on Cutter's Ridge, he stood in the driveway for a long moment and asked me the only question that seemed to matter to him by then. Would you have let us freeze? If the shelter hadn't been an option, would you really have kept that door shut? I told him the truth. I'd have found another way to keep you alive, Rick. I have never once in my whole life been willing to let harm happen that I could prevent. But keeping you alive and keeping you warm inside my house were never the same promise. And you spent 11 years assuming they were, because it was easier than asking.
He didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there is one.
I moved the twins' new court-ordered education trust into an account that exists entirely separate from anything with two names on it, the way I should have built things from the very beginning, the way 22 years of logistics work should have taught me to build every system that mattered. My father spends most weekends at the cabin now, in the recliner by the wood stove, and Courtney's old joke about the trailer trash blanket has become, without either of us planning it, a small private joke of our own. Because it turns out that blanket is still in the cupboard under the wood stove, and it's the first thing I reach for on cold nights. And there is a particular, quiet justice in the fact that the thing they mocked as worthless was the exact thing that kept my father warmest when it mattered most. People sometimes ask me, when they hear a shortened version of that night, whether I regret closing that door. I don't, but I want to be precise about why, because I think the honest answer matters more than the satisfying one. I don't regret it, because it was never really about the door. It was about finally understanding that shelter isn't something you're owed just by showing up cold and frightened at someone else's threshold, expecting the person who has spent her whole life containing everyone else's emergencies to contain this one too, without question, without cost, one more time. Real shelter is something you build, carefully, honestly, in the years before the storm ever comes. And it's something you extend to people in proportion to what they've extended to you, not in proportion to how loudly they knock. I think for a long time, I confused being useful with being valued, the same way I think Rick confused being loved with being rescued. Both mistakes come from the same place, I've come to believe. A quiet, learned assumption that love is something you earn by absorbing whatever gets put on you, rather than something two people build by actually noticing what's being put on the other person and choosing, again and again, not to add to the weight. I spent 22 years building systems strong enough to survive worst-case scenarios I never even saw coming. It took a blizzard, a stolen college fund, and my own father shivering on a paint bucket to teach me I had never once applied that same engineering to my own front door. My father still calls me Maya Bird. He still says, now and then, half joking, that I built the safest building on that whole mountain, and it turned out the most important thing it ever sheltered wasn't supplies or equipment at all. It was him, on a bad night, when everyone else had already decided where he belonged. If any part of this reminds you of a door you've been standing in front of for too long, wondering whether keeping someone warm and keeping them welcome are supposed to be the same thing, I'd ask you to sit with that question a little longer than I did before the storm makes you answer it for real.